Perhaps, he thought, Joe's cross is in there, and the box of money. I must wait and watch. I can tell Arthur about it tomorrow. But Joe didn't come out. At midnight it began to rain, and Romeo waited all night in the cold street. In the morning he could not move, and he could not speak. Mrs. Catherine, a woman from the church, found him in the street. She took him to her home and put him to bed, and there he stayed for 2 weeks. He was very ill, and so he did not hear about Arthur and Becky. But on Sunday morning, all London knew about Arthur and Becky, because they were not on the boat when it came back to the village. Where were they? Were they lost in the cave? And were they alive or dead? At first, Arthur and Becky played with their friends in the cave. Then Arthur wanted to go down a new tunnel, and Becky went with him. They walked and talked, and went into a second tunnel, then a third. Sometimes Arthur put a mark with candle smoke on the tunnel wall. He wanted to find the mouth of the cave again. Then they came out of the tunnels into a big room. There were hundreds of bats in this room, and the candles woke them up. Arthur took Becky's hand, and they ran into the nearest tunnel, with the bats behind them. But one bat hit Becky's candle, and it went out. The children ran and ran through the tunnels, and at last they got away from the bats. They stopped and sat down. Suddenly it was very, very quiet. "Where are we now, Arthur?" Becky whispered, afraid. "I don't know," said Arthur. "I think it is time to go back. But we can't go through that big room because of the bats. Let's go down this tunnel." Went down one tunnel, then a second, a third, a fourth. Then they wanted to find the big room with the bats again, but they couldn't. Becky began to cry. "Arthur, we can't get out. We are lost. Arthur, we are lost." They walked and walked. When they were tired, they sat down. Then they got up and walked again. Time went by. Was it day or night? They didn't know. Then Arthur wanted to find water. They had nothing to eat, and they must have something to drink. They found a very small river and sat down next to it. Becky said, "Arthur, we must stay here near this river. This is our last candle." And he did not finish. But Becky understood. "Arthur." "Yes, Becky." "Are they going to come and look for us?" "Of course, when the boat gets to London. But how can they find us in these hundreds of tunnels?" "Oh, Arthur, Arthur, we are going to die in here." Becky began to cry again. Then the candle went out, and the two children were in the dark. They sat for hours and hours. They slept a little, then woke up, then slept again. Was it Sunday now, or Monday? Suddenly Arthur sat up. "Listen, somebody's calling." The two children listened. They heard it again, a little nearer. They called back. Then they began to walk down the tunnel in the dark with their hands on the wall. They stopped and listened again, but now they couldn't hear anything. Slowly they went back to the river. They slept again and woke up very, very hungry. "Perhaps it's Tuesday now," Arthur thought. "What can I do? I must do something." Then he had an idea. "Becky, listen. I've got a long string in my pocket. I can go down some of the small tunnels and get back to you with the string. You wait here." Slowly and carefully, Arthur went down the first tunnel on his hands and knees. Then the tunnel wall on his right finished, and there was nothing. Arthur put out his hand to feel the floor, and just then away to his right he saw a hand with a candle. At once Arthur called out, "Help!" he cried. The hand moved, and Arthur saw an arm and a face. It was Joe. Arthur was very afraid, but Joe was afraid too, and he quickly ran away down the tunnel. Arthur went back to Becky, but he did not tell her about Joe. Arthur waited for an hour, then went into a different tunnel with his string, then a third tunnel. It was Tuesday evening, and London waited. Many of the villagers were in the cave, and they looked for the children day and night, but they heard nothing, saw nothing, and found nothing. Then, late that evening, there was a sudden noise in the streets. People began to run to the Becky's house. "They are here. Becky and Arthur are here." Most of the village came to listen to Arthur's story. It was in the sixth tunnel. He told them, "I went to the end of my string, and suddenly I could see daylight. There was a little hole in the cave wall. I put my head out, and there was the river right under my nose. I went back and got Becky, and we climbed out through the hole. Then we stopped a boat on the river. We were 5 miles from the mouth of the cave." Arthur was very tired after his 3 days in the cave, and he went to bed and stayed there for 2 days. He heard about Romeo and went to see him on Sunday, and then every day, but Mrs. Catherine was always in the room. "You can just say hello," she told Arthur, "and then you must go. Romeo is very ill, and he needs to sleep." So Arthur could not talk about anything exciting, and he could not tell Romeo about Joe. One day, about 2 weeks after the picnic, Arthur was in Becky's house, and her father came in. "Well, Arthur," Mrs. Becky said, "would you like to go back to the cave again one day?" "I'm not afraid of that cave," said Arthur. Mrs. Becky laughed. "There are a lot of people like you, Arthur, but nobody's going into the cave again. There are big doors across the cave mouth now, and nobody can open them." Arthur's face went white. "But Mr. Joe is in that cave." An hour later, 50 men were at the cave, and they opened the doors. Joe was on the ground, dead, his face to the door, and his knife in his hand. The day after Joe's funeral, Romeo was out of bed. He and Arthur walked slowly out of the village. They had a good long talk, and Romeo heard all about the picnic, the cave, and Joe. "We are never going to find the money now," said Romeo. "Romeo," said Arthur, "the money isn't in London. It is in the cave." "I know it is." "Why was Joe in the cave?" "Because he took the box of money there, right?" Romeo looked excited. "Say that again, Arthur." "The money is in the cave, and we can get to it easily. Let's go there now. I've got some candles and a long string. We can take a boat and put it back later." 20 minutes later, the boys were in a boat on the Mississippi. They went 8 miles down the river, and then Arthur stopped by some small trees. "Here we are," he said. Arthur's hole was just behind the trees. Arthur took a candle and climbed in. Romeo climbed in after him. "Joe never found this hole," said Arthur, "or he did find it and couldn't get through it. It's very small." The boys went carefully through the tunnels with their string. Then Arthur stopped. "I saw Joe about here," he said. And look, Romeo, there is the cross. There was a big smoke cross on the tunnel wall. The boys looked up and down the tunnel, but there was no box of money. Joe said under the cross, said Arthur. Perhaps it is under the ground. Look, we can move these stones. The boys took their knives and began to dig by the tunnel wall. Very soon they found a second, smaller tunnel under the wall. They climbed down into it and came into a small room. There was a bed, 2 whiskey bottles, some old shoes, and a box of money. When somebody finds treasure, everybody hears about it very quickly. The 2 boys carried the box through the village, and when they got to Aunt Nancy's house, half the village was with them. Everybody went into the house. "Oh, Arthur, Arthur," cried Aunt Nancy, "what is it now? And what have you got there?" Arthur put the box on the table and opened it. There were $12,000 in the box, and suddenly Arthur Sawyer and Romeo were the richest people in London.